Now, we've talked about different types of experiences or different ideologies, let's say, of trans people, and most of the focus has been on from male to female, and the Blanchard taxonomy applies to them. And with girls, we're speaking mostly recently about the rapid onset gender dysphoria, which I'm not sure how it is in the UK. I think in North America, I think the number of cases among girls in the last couple of years has increased by, I think, 18 times perhaps, and among boys 7 times. I believe that's around the numbers. And so for the first time, natal or biological girls are far outnumbering boys. So it seems to be a social contagion, and very few people are talking about this. But I really haven't heard much about the young girl who, from a very young age, Miranda, you were talking about like older girls who had already developed their sense of sexual orientation. They felt, I guess, confident in being a lesbian. But what about the very, very young girl who, from the very youngest of age, seems to be, quote unquote, a boy, as the kind of the flip side of the cases where, from the very youngest of ages to the oldest of ages, for all intents and purposes, they are, quote unquote, female. There's no ifs and ands about it. They are so, quote unquote, feminine in their sense of being. And I know that then begs the question of what is feminine, but the point is, do we have that parallel with girls where from the very youngest of ages, they were a girl, but there's no doubt she was, quote unquote, a boy?
To tell the truth, there's much more that I've seen on this rapid onset gender dysphoria with girls. There's not so much on young girls. Also, because I'm an adult psychotherapist, the sorts of situations in which I see this are like, say, the parents of a young teen trans female to male person, and some slightly older cases. But I have come across people in that context who do say that from an early age they've declared themselves to be a boy, although they're biologically a girl. But I haven't seen and I haven't got personal experience to be able to say enough about how that may be happening, why that may be happening. And it certainly doesn't seem to be as common as rapid onset later gender dysphoria in girls.
Miranda, have you come across that?
It's a particularly rare phenomenon. I think to some degree there has been so much resistance amongst activists to the way that research is being done in these types of fields. And I think that the way that the conversations we're able to have, even the way we're able to, we can't exchange ideas about this. To some degree, I think with the incidence of young girls who are transitioning have become the collateral damage of what has been a very, very tight control over the narrative of transsexualism or transgenderism. And I think that there's a problem in that there hasn't been as much work done about females who transition to male. If you talk to Ray Blanchard, who I've spoken to and communicated with a few times, he's got a number of ideas about it, but it doesn't seem to be quite the same sort of differentiation that we have between males, although Blanchard doesn't rule out there being a similar component, or should I say an erotic component in females that there is in males, although the two things are not necessarily comparable. I think it's, to some degree, we've ended up with the system that we deserve, because what's happened is that instead of standing up to the rather aggressive way in which the transgender narrative has been policed and put forward, I think that people just don't want that amount of grief in their life and just want to keep their head down. And there is a problem as well, of course, that people's livelihoods are attacked. A response to disagreement is to smear it as hate and smear the people as much as you can. And we are looking at the lives of children. And I think that coming back to what you were saying, Owen, about having a child that was to all intents and purposes a female, although they're a boy, what the heck does that mean? Being a boy or being a girl is based upon your reproductive system. It's based upon your reproductive potential, should I say, or your reproductive class. What does it mean to say that a boy is feminine, therefore is a girl? What are we actually saying when we say that? Surely what we're saying to the boy is that your behaviour within our culture suggests that you belong to a different sex class. It's just rife with misogyny and stereotyping and, dare I say it, homophobia. You look at the gender non-conforming boys that I've written about and based upon the research that I've done, and it's like people who are homosexual or children that grow up to be homosexual display what we would call gender non-conforming behaviour when they're children. They follow stereotypes that are the dichotomy of their natal sex, and we live under a lot of cultural pressure to adhere to the cultural stereotypes that fit with our natal sex. And again, this is another problem I think that transgender people are not addressing, in that the abuse and grief that they get, which is generally from men in the street, not from feminists or radical feminists, the abuse that they would get from the man in the street is because they're gender non-conforming. I think what they should be doing is fighting to have the sex-based stereotypes erased from society so that people can do what they want. If a child wants to play with whatever, let them play with whatever. If a man wants to wear a pink dress and a floppy hat all the time, then let them do that. I think it is the antithesis of what it means to be compassionate or understanding, particularly to children or even to anybody, to say that your personality mismatches your body, therefore your body's wrong. To me, that sounds cruel.
Can I add something to that?
Sure.
Which is Miranda saying something important about homophobia, which can be one motive for somebody identifying as trans. Another motive, as a mental health professional, is the kind of huge stigma that still exists in society about mental health problems. And so to say to somebody, look, you may be struggling with emotional issues to do with your family or emergent sexuality or whatever it is, feels like an accusation of madness. And there they are, they're kind of confronted by people coming around to educate them about gender in school from the age of 5 or 6, telling them you might not be the same gender as your biological body. And suddenly there's a way out of being accused of madness. It's not very fashionable to be mad, but it's really cool to be trans. Everybody celebrates that. And so who wouldn't grab at that? But then once you're on that slippery slope, you're moving towards the inevitable medicalization. And I think what might easily happen is we have a huge number of lawsuits from people later down the line who feel they've been really badly let down by professionals such as ourselves.
Right. Well, you've brought up a number of issues, so I'm going to try to tackle them one by one. The first one is when people talk about trans not being a recent phenomenon, and they say, look, it's been around forever, and they talk about different cultures where there's that third sex or the third gender, depending on which word they prefer to use. And they point to India, then they point to other countries where they've long recognized that. They say that, again, long before today's culture or the modern Western culture, that there has been an accepted other category, even including, First Nations people or Native people, depending on which country you're in. So people who travel around the world say there is this third category, and I think it's almost exclusively biological males who they don't medically transition just because, of course, historically they didn't have that capacity, but they were accepted as this someone in between or someone different. What are your thoughts on that?
My thoughts on that are that this third gender type of category on these indigenous cultures is another great example of the way that transgender activists will appropriate anything that's not screwed down onto the floor. A lot of these cultures that have this third gender in society, this third gender or third type of person, is essentially a way of dealing with homosexuality within the culture. And it's not comparable to transgenderism because most of the males who are transgender are heterosexual males. Would
you say then that in, let's say, today's society, so for the homosexual, transsexual, would you think more that they are really just regular gay men who maybe are homophobic and do not want to live an identity that way? Or is there something else going on that would explain why they've medically changed?
It's an interesting question. Again, not an awful lot is known about it. So one of the problems that exists within transgender culture with Blanchard's typology is that because it differentiates between homosexual and non-homosexual transsexuals, and the vector behind non-homosexual transsexuals is erotically based, so it's a paraphilic love of the self. There is a understanding within transgender culture that what it's actually doing is it's creating a good trans and a bad trans. Now, I think it's completely counterproductive to look at it like that. It's rather unfair to look at it like that when you consider that most of the people who are transgender today are the non-homosexual form of transsexual. I think as well that what it is, it's a way of trying to claim some sort of validity, in that you've got people saying that if there are two types of transsexuals, the homosexual and the non-homosexual transsexual, then there's one population, which is the homosexual transsexual, who are more valid than the other. Again, it's folly. I don't think that that's the right conclusion, because as far as males becoming females go, they are both equally valid in that they're completely invalid. As males, you can't change sex, you can't transcend your bodily sex. So neither form is more valid than the other.
This question of different cultures, it's a bit strange for something that might need medical treatment that's not a pathology. I mean, if there is this sort of naturally occurring category of people in Samoa, the Far Afafine, for instance, and there's Vanessa, a person who wrote about her experience, and she's a biological male who has a place in her culture as Far Afafine, and she became ill on American Samoa and was taken into hospital and offered the surgery because she was identified as a transsexual male to female trans woman, and just said, well, why would I possibly want to surgically alter my body? I'm perfectly happy as I am being a Far Afafine, leave me alone. So there might be an argument that we should be able to create places in our culture where people like Vanessa can feel more at home without having to surgically transition, just as there's an argument that people who are autogynephilic ought to be able to be helped to accept and feel at home with their autogynephilia. But that brings me back to my original point. What about helping people try to feel more at home in their bodies rather than trying to alter their bodies in order to make them fit in with their minds, the subjective sense of their gender identity?
I think it's a good point. I would question whether or not we would have the same number of trans surgeries if our objective was to help people who were clearly autogynephilic come to terms with their own autogynephilia and understand that the reason that they feel the way that they do is because of this inwardly directed sexual orientation, and then help them to have happier and more stable and more enjoyable lives. Because a lot of people go through this and it creates an awful lot of problems. Turning to a point that you raised before about the stigma of mental health, again, that itself provides a very interesting example of the way that the vectors within transgender culture work, in that mental health has got a stigma. Transgenderism or transsexuality is in the DSM as being a mental illness. That's bad, having transgender as being a mental illness, because it stigmatizes. What should we do about it? Do we destigmatize mental illness and show that we can be nice and happy and productive members of society and have stable and fulfilling lives, even though we would live with something that would be classified as mental illness? Or do we say, no, let's take transgenderism out of the mental illness box and make it into something else? What would be more productive for society on a whole? It would, of course, be destigmatizing the mental health issues that people have, rather than saying, well, it's nothing to do with being mentally ill. If you're a man that seriously believes that you're a woman, that you're female, yet you've fathered several children and whatever, clearly you've got mental health problems that need to be resolved. And I think if you spend any time looking at trans people on the internet, not that I'm going to diagnose anybody with problems, you'll see if you look at the behaviour of trans people on the internet, there is a significant number of comorbid mental health issues going on there that appear to me as an outsider to be getting very, very little attention from anybody. Yet the moment that they go off to get hormones, it's like, oh yeah, take them, you'll be fine. And it seems to be counterproductive.
Yeah, I mean, there is a lot of autistic spectrum association. I mean, it's not the only association.
Oh, goodness me.
That's
There's
part
someone
of
that
it.
follows me on Twitter he's autistic. Sorry, excuse me. She's autistic, and they're going to have gender reassignment surgery done to have their penis turned inside out and whatever. And it's like, this person's autistic. I've spoken to them a number of times about stuff on Twitter. I've shown to them very clearly that the etiology of their transsexualism is autogynephilic. You can see it very clearly. And they're autistic. They probably have some other issues going on as well. And they're going off to be castrated. And it seems to me we're doing wrong by these people.
There's also this logical inconsistency, which is if it's not any sort of pathology and it gets taken out of DSM, then obviously it doesn't need any sort of treatment. So it's just like being gay. Well, let people go and get on with it then. End of story. We'll all go home.
As we all know, there's being transgender and being gay, they have absolutely nothing to do with each other.
No, not really, except in terms of homophobia, as you pointed out rightly earlier. Some people who can't accept their own homosexuality would rather be trans. Others, of course, do accept their homosexuality despite being trans.
As a psychologist, as an educator, for me, it really is important to get a better understanding of this, because people's lives are literally on the line, whether it's through mental health issues or through medical surgeries or the trauma that goes on within a family. I've been speaking now with a lot of parents of children, most of whom have this rapid onset gender dysphoria. And it must be so terrible to a parent who all they want to do is help their child, and they're not buying into this mythology, and they are getting the same type of backlash as, let's say, parents of autistic children used to get, where it was told, well, you must have been a bad mother. Your child has autism. What did you do? You're a refrigerator mom. And I can't believe that 60 years or so later, with respect to autism, we've kind of arrived at the same place. Parents cannot have an honest discussion and can't get good facts about this. So I will ask each of you, what can be done, aside from speaking out like this, what can be done to help get better answers as to what is the nature of, let's say, trans people, and what is the best way to help, let's say, a child to begin with, who is questioning their sexual identity, their sexual orientation, their personal identity? What is the best way?
Well, I think Miranda put a finger on it earlier by saying, well, you should allow a child to experiment and to play and to adopt different roles and different identities without pushing them down a particular path. So I think, unfortunately, the trans affirmation does push people down a particular path, and it has unfortunate consequences. I think it's moving people more towards medicalization. So I think that's one thing we've got badly wrong and we need to think about. And so that's one thing the book is questioning. is sort of trans-affirmative orthodoxy. Is that really helpful, or does it have unintended consequences? The other thing personally that I think is important to question is this myth that it's biologically based, that there's something going on in the fetal brain that means you've got this brain essence of male born in a female body, or vice versa. Because until we actually get some science that proves that, there's no actual evidence. It's just a hypothesis. But it's a damaging hypothesis because it makes people think that a bodily intervention is going to be more effective than any other one, a psychological or a social one. So those are the things that I think we're getting wrong and should address. The bigger question about how we organise society, well, I think we've got a society where we raise people in a lot of isolation, a lot of loneliness. And personally, I think we could learn a lot from evolutionary psychology about how to organise our society better so that we get more of what we need emotionally. We're very successful materially, but I just think psychologically we're creating, for nearly all of us, a lot of problems, particularly mind-body problems to do with dissociation and psychosomatic issues, but that's another story. That's a much broader question, I think.
I think we have a culture where people are very, very isolated and very, very lonely, yet they find comfort at the end of a text message or going on the internet, whereas these inventions are extremely clever. They're great inventions for communication. I think that what they have done is they are creating little niches of culture, and we are a bit of a cultural niche, what we're talking about here, because we're supposed to be 0.3% of the population or something. And I think that, suggesting that we should be medicalising 1% or 10% of the population because they don't conform to stereotypes, to me sounds really fucking stupid.
And something that you brought up earlier, and I think it's very important, and I was hoping to speak with Dr. Ken Zucker, but because of what's happening with CAMH, the Center for Addiction and Mental Health, for people who don't know, he's not able to talk about this publicly. But I've lectured on him as well, and I've heard many different stories, both from people who knew patients who went through the clinic and colleagues of Dr. Zucker's. So here's kind of the biggest controversy that I see, and I want to ask each of you about this. When I first heard of Dr. Zucker, worst man on the planet. He was just labeled as doing conversion therapy. He's a monster. And then there was a BBC special that I believe one of you had mentioned in your chapter that people were petitioning not to let it play because it gave maybe a more fair and balanced perspective on Dr. Zucker and his work. But the biggest controversial aspect, I believe, and I want to ask each of you, is that in his clinic, the first rule is that the parents are supposed to have the children play with only gender-typical toys and dress in gender-typical ways. That's sort of the first step. I'm not going to call it conversion therapy, but it goes against what you were saying earlier about saying, what's wrong with having a society where any child can do anything they want as long as they're not harming other people? So what are your thoughts on that first step of intervention?
Well, it sounds quite behavioral. And in terms of CBT, I can see where he's coming from. He's wanting to reinforce the gender stereotype of the biological body. So I can see it makes a kind of sense, but I'm not a CBT practitioner. I'm much more in favour of allowing the unconscious to develop and see where it goes. And so I would certainly not practice that sort of therapy myself, but I wouldn't think he was wrong for practicing it. I think it's worth thinking about whether that might be helpful or not. If it was my child, I think I would try and allow the child to be as gender fluid and as experimental as they want it to be. Although I don't see young children, I do see adolescents sometimes. And similarly, I wouldn't try and stop them or encourage them one way or just to express themselves and see where it goes.
I think that the worst thing that we can do is to unquestioningly affirm the concept that a child has got a transgender identity or that they are in the wrong body for whatever reason. I saw the documentary. I thought it was very good and very balanced. I agreed with a lot of what it said. I disagreed with a few things about what it said, but I thought that it was a very, very good piece of work. And I think the BBC did itself proud, both in the way that it presented this and the way that it resisted the amount of bullying that was going on, the way that people were desperately, desperately trying to stop this programme from being aired. As far as keeping children playing with one particular type of toy, described as being for one sex or the other, I don't know to what degree that was practised by Zucker, and I don't know enough about the way that that was done. The underlying reasoning for it and whatever, I think it's very difficult as lay people who aren't involved in that to really cast any judgment on it. I could see it being a meritorious approach if there was a constant message of reinforcement on the child, that a girl was a boy or a boy was a girl, that getting away from that, I think, is very important. And, coming back to what I'm saying, I think affirming this transgender identity, I think, is the worst thing that we can do. And looking at what's happening with schools at the moment, particularly within the UK, I think it would be a great idea if we could get groups like Mermaids Gender and Gyres and Gendered Intelligence removed from the classrooms and removed from any involvement with young children, because I think that the message that they're promoting is absolutely redeemably negative, and it's unquestioning over what it means to be trans and the suitability of this type of behavioural pattern and medicalisation of essentially behavioural non-conformity within children. I find the whole industry that's grown up around this, that's focusing on children, to be incorrigible, and I don't think that they should be in schools.
If they are in schools, they should be in schools with gender critical people equally present. And if they're going to be there educating about being trans and celebrating that, they should be celebrating being lesbian, being gay, being gender fluid, and they should have mental health awareness days where they stop stigmatizing people for having mental health problems and encourage people to reach out and talk about them.
The word gender critical is obviously based in ideology. I would have suggested really that our approach to dealing with these organisations really is to addressing them in the field that they cannot defend, and that is the field of science. Because what they're suggesting, that children are born with a personality that mismatches their sex, there's nothing in science to suggest this. What we do know from science is that gender non-conforming behaviour is indicative of sexual orientation, and that some people will grow out of it. Some people will grow up to be heterosexual, some people will grow up to be homosexual. What we get from desistance rates is that the desistance rate is very, very high with children, and that seems to be being twisted around, again, for political reasons, with absolutely no interest in finding out what the real picture is.
There are very, very influential websites out there which lots of the kids are reading, and they come and they show their parents how they're coming out. There's a kind of letter which they cut and paste from the internet, informed by some of these organisations that Miranda's talking about. And the big word in the middle of the page is science shows that changes in the brain of the fetus have caused you to have this condition. And it's just misinformation. And it's dangerous misinformation because it's leading people into medicalisation. Those people should not be allowed to have those sites up there saying those things, but who's policing that?
I agree, even if there are people affected by, I guess you're talking about in utero hormone levels or whatever, it doesn't mean you're the opposite sex.
If they did discover something like that, it would really just be another form of being intersex. It wouldn't be being trans anymore. Because the intersex condition is that you've got a biological ambiguity about which sex you are. So if there was such a thing discovered, you then have the whole Alice Strager thing about, well, okay, so you're born with a male brain and a female body. Shouldn't you grow up to a point where you've decided whether you want to have surgery or not? Shouldn't you try and find ways of living with that? Is it right to encourage people to transition before they're fully mature? It becomes just the same question as the intersex, and there always will be other people who aren't intersex, even if they did find in some people there was some as yet undiscovered brain thing going on in the womb. It won't cover all of the people by any stretch of the imagination. So I think it's still going to come back in most cases, even if not in all cases, to a kind of unconscious process, which is encouraging the person to identify as the opposite gender to their biological sex. And those are the sorts of cases that I'm talking about in the book, where I give a few case examples explaining that.
And a couple of things that came up. When we talk about desistance, this is what I find to be ironic. When Dr. Cantor did a blog article where he said that the rates are between 60 and 90%, looking at several studies, doing long-term follow-ups on trans children, people pin the number around 80%. And then critics of those numbers say, well, many of those people aren't really trans people, then we can't call them desisters. Well, then let's actually define what it means to be trans.
Good luck with that.
That's the problem, isn't it? There's no such test and there's no such definition. It just comes down to a subjective impression. And people, like psychologists, are supposed to be the gatekeepers to decide who gets surgery and who doesn't. But these are gatekeepers with no way of telling who should or should not go through the gate. You can't know until after the event. So wouldn't it be much safer and more sensible not to let anybody below proper maturity to go through that gate? And shouldn't we be examining what the pressures are that are creating the demand for hormones and surgery in these kids? Because you talk to the psychologists at the gender identity clinics and they're fighting off demands for hormones and surgery, or at least for hormones. And there's a huge social pressure, and it's to do with social contagion, to do with internet groups, to do with misinformation being spread, to do with a pressure group which has got control of the agenda, as Miranda says, in schools, in the legal framework, in the law, and in the psychotherapeutic profession. We can't practice conversion therapy. I'm in the position where if I help somebody feel more at home in their own bodies, I could be accused of conversion therapy, because their core essence of their inner gendered identity has been changed by a better feeling of being at home in their body.
I think calling it conversion therapy isn't right, because it's not conversion therapy, not in the way that they refer to conversion therapy. And again, it's another one of the things that I said before, that unless it's bolted to the floor, transgender culture will appropriate it and twist it and use it to their own favour.
Right.
I mean, seriously, it happens with so many things. Look at, for example, intersex. Bizarrely and unfavourably towards trans people that claim, it's like, well, intersex exists, therefore transgender exists, or whatever. Plenty of examples of intersex demonstrate very clearly that the whole ideology behind transgenderism is utter bunk. The whole concept of innate gender identity is bunk. As I've observed before, I find the concept of gender identity anyway to be nothing other than just good old-fashioned sexism.
And it's ironic because with intersex individuals, they're going in the opposite direction. They're pushing not to rush to surgery, to let the person feel what's best for their own body, rather than having that decision made for them. Yet the opposite is happening with trans kids. They're rushing in the opposite direction. So I want to ask you, one, I don't think anyone's come up with this answer. There's a lot of theories behind it. But given that rates of true trans, I know people don't like that term, but let's say if we narrowly define, let's say, transsexual people, how did we get with such low rates, and amongst transsexual people, only a tiny percentage of people would actually be activists? How did we get such a tiny population or group yielding so much power? I don't know if I've seen any other movement so disproportionately grab so much attention, power, policy making in such a short period of time, it seems. What happened?
I've written about this several times. I think a lot of this originates at the point where the T was tacked onto the end of LGB and it became all about money. You look at the amount of money that's washing around with LGBT organisations. Pride is like, it's big corporate stuff. It's a big deal. You look at the way that Stonewall's financed. It's courting banking companies and insurance companies and things like that. When you think about it, going back 30 years, we had a government that was proposing to outlaw the discussion of homosexuality in schools. And the government at the time was supported wholeheartedly by big businesses and whatever. And now we have big businesses supporting transgenderism. You couldn't make it up. But it's all about the money. And I did a blog about someone who works at a bank in London that they present as one person some days and another person in other days. And they're saying about how empowering it is and how wonderful it is to be themselves. And they've leveraged mermaids into that particular environment because they're at the bank. The bank is very supportive. It's, this is a large international institution. If this person actually gave a fuck about people being themselves and about equality and about equity in work and the way that people are treated, instead of turning up in a stripper wig and short skirt, bearing in mind this is a male who's still married to a woman who has 2 children, instead of turning up into work as being a stereotypical man's idea of what it is to be a woman, if he took these ideas and campaigned and did something more useful, like, we had this case in PwC in central London a couple of years ago where a woman who was temping at one of the firms there lost her job because she refused to wear high heels. That is the sort of thing that we need to be fighting, not just fighting to reinforce sex-based stereotypes. But it's all about the money. I mean, if you look at GLAD and you look at Stonewall in this country, it's all about the money. Both organisations no longer give a fuck about gay people or lesbians or bisexual people. It's all about the trans. There's been stuff that's been happening in this country with Stonewall, which is an absolute shame on that organisation. They should feel utterly disgusted with themselves for the things that they have been doing and tacitly approving.
I just wonder if it's like this, that some people who are trans are pathologically unable to doubt their own position, pathologically unable to question the wisdom of their own medical transition. I mean, some people who decide to have surgery and hormones have had therapy, they've examined it, they've decided it's the best thing for them to do, and they're happy or relatively happy with that. And that's absolutely fine. I've got no problem with it. But there are some people who I think have used it as a kind of catch-all, a way to get away from their psychological problems, like the first patient I told you about. And then they daren't think about whether they've made the right decision or the wrong decision. So if somebody starts talking about detransitioning, it raises a doubt. But because they can't doubt for themselves, they have to police that person. So detransitioning research gets closed down. If you start talking about unconscious processes, they have to doubt, have I done this because I've got something unconscious that I don't want to look at? well, no, I can't think that. So I think they start policing the other person because they're unable to have their own doubts internally. And I think where it comes from is if you build an identity around something and that sense of identity is questioned, that's a really threatening thing to do.
I think that's a fair observation that you're making. If you look at the essay Becoming What We Love that Anne Lawrence wrote, you'll see there that the observation is made that a lot of these men transition after a bit of a crisis in their lives. And it all comes down to this idea of challenging people's core identity. They're building this construct of themselves, and challenging that is very, very threatening. It should be no surprise that it's threatening, especially with an environment where you can't even discuss it. You have to remember, a lot of people are coming to this from a very, very lonely place. They've lost their friends and their family and their support and whatever. They suddenly find the support within the trans group. They ain't going to want to piss those people off because they know that the moment that they come out with anything that goes against the central mantra of trans women and women, that they will be excommunicated and ostracised, and they will lose their support network and all their friends. It's a cult.
Horrible. And the detransitioners who come out of it really are vilified, ostracised and hated, and they're very, very brave people. So I really feel grateful to Chris, my first patient, for having the courage to do what he did, even though he eventually got closed down by pressure groups and so on.
I think if the people who are causing this problem with detransitioners actually thought about it, they should realise that detransition should be taken as being a successful outcome of transition. If someone has reached a point where they can thinking to themselves, I know what I need to do to make the rest of my life tolerable for me, this is what I'm going to do, I think that's great.
You know, it's sad because I can understand where, let's say, a trans kid who, if we think of this generation, the young generation, so much of their life is spent online. So much of their socialization is through online. And so I can understand if that's your community. As you were saying a few seconds ago, it's terrifying to think that I would lose everything and everybody I've worked so hard to gain. I understand that. I get that. What infuriates me is that people who've bought into the trans narrative, not the kids themselves, not any adults who think they're trans, but the doctors, the mental health professionals, the advocates, all the activists, their belief system, they've bought into this so strongly, and this is cognitive dissonance. It would be so terrifying to think that they could be wrong. But if you're wrong, what the hell have you lost? Nothing. Maybe a bit of embarrassment, maybe some time, maybe some effort, maybe the realization that you may have actually harmed some people along the way, but not with ill intent, just because you weren't aware of all the facts. For these people not to be able to step outside of their own egos, their own narcissism, and to realize maybe we don't know everything, maybe we are going down the wrong path, maybe for the sake of the people we are ostensibly trying to help, we should put the brakes on and understand better. The fact that they aren't able to do that, they don't have the cognitive or emotional strength and wherewithal to do that, that's infuriating because that's not their identity. I mean, it becomes their identity, but it shouldn't be. It's very different from a trans child wrapped up in the narrative.
Yeah, and here, we have a responsibility as professionals to those trans kids, and, you know, I think we failed them.
I think so too. And now, if I can ask, Robert, because in your chapter, you mentioned, again, the psychoanalytic or psychodynamic explanations for why somebody might feel that they are trans. One of the things that you mentioned, which I think most strongly relates to this rapid onset gender dysphoria, especially in girls, is this idea of identification or a failure to mourn properly. Would you mind just quickly elaborating on that? Because I think people need to hear that.
So I'll make a general statement, but I have seen in a few cases, some of the people I supervise also see trans kids. So I'm getting my information from a number of sources. And the hypothesis that I put forward in the book is roughly this, that sometimes if there's a failure to mourn, one solution is to identify with the missing person. So that's the first thing, which actually just comes straight from Freud, really. But how that relates to trans kids, and particularly trans girls who identify as male, is like this. I think in our culture, increasingly, as the gender roles get more mixed up, there are more men involved in the childcare. And sometimes young children form a primary bond with their father rather than their mother. But still in our culture, when couples break up and there's divorce, it's very often the mother who keeps the main custody of the children. Maybe the father moves away and starts a new family even. And then the girl is left with two things, a catastrophic loss of her primary love object. And if she's unable to mourn it, she may feel it's safer to identify with him, with the missing father. And the other thing is that that might also unconsciously act as some sort of compensation to a grieving mother for the loss of the partner. So what I'm trying to say in the chapter is that sometimes if the child feels unable to really get upset about the missing father and to work through that grief properly, this process of identification might be contributing to the cross-sex identification of the child. And that might be one reason why there are more young girls identifying as trans males than there used to be. So it's a hypothesis. It's not one that I'm in a position to scientifically validate yet. It's just anecdotal based on a few cases. But the person I took it from originally was DeSegli, who set up the Portman Clinic at the Tavistock, the Child Identity, Gender Identity Clinic there. And I used a case of his where it's very clearly happened, where there's a young boy who is primarily brought up by the grandmother. And when the grandmother tragically dies, he starts cross-dressing and identifying as a girl. And DeSegli takes him into therapy aged about 8, having identified as a trans kid. And through a process of allowing him to play and then actually beginning to mourn the grandmother, the identification just goes of its own accord. So I use his case as a kind of structure to put the idea across. But it's an idea that I think resonates with my clinical experience, limited though it is. I don't know if others would find the same thing in their practice. There are probably lots of people out there who could confirm or deny that hypothesis much better than me.
Well, I'll tell you, it's a tough sell for 3 reasons. 1, of course, because it goes against the typical trans narrative. 2, because you dropped the F-bomb, Freud. And, still, and I say this
F-bomb.
I say this to my students all the time. There were many things wrong with Freud's theories and with some of the things he said, but other observations that he made, clinical observations, were genius. And we shouldn't throw the baby out with the bathwater. And it's not necessarily Freud that is informing some of these more modern understandings of our unconscious and our psyche and everything. So to pretend that all of this is some antiquated, outdated, and disproved theory is wrong. One of my 8 orientations is psychodynamic. I'm also object relations and others. But the third reason that you're going to have a tough sell is that you are implicitly, whether you like it or not, people are going to accuse you of implicitly arguing against, let's say, single mothers or non-nuclear families. And how dare you say that a father's absence in the home can somehow have any negative impact on a child, because there are many people out in society who have a vested interest in arguing you can't say that. One parent's just as good as 2 parents. And logically, it doesn't make sense. And I'm not saying that we have to go back to some old-fashioned nuclear family is the only way to go. I'm not saying that. But I do a lot of parenting capacity assessments. I've done 450 of them. And it amazes me when a young mother, for example, has got 3 kids under 5 years old, and they're deathly sick, and they have to somehow take a kid to school. It's like, I wouldn't be able to do that.
Absolutely, yeah. No, I think that's exactly right. And it's hard enough bringing up children in a 2-parent family. I'm sure it's much harder bringing them up in a 1-parent family. But that brings me back to the other point that I was making earlier, which is that I also think we kind of live in this isolation in our culture as well. And that contributes to it. So I'm not trying to say mothers don't do a brilliant job, but I think the way we've organized our culture is to put a huge, huge burden on those single parents. And they are usually single mothers. And so, I think they need as much support as they can get. And I think we should organize our culture better so that we have more collective responsibility. I mean, I date back to the old hippie commune days, really, and also an appeal to evolutionary psychology, the idea that we lived in small groups when we were hunter-gathering for hundreds of thousands of years, and we only just settled into an agricultural society 10,000 years ago, 5,000 years ago, and we're not really equipped to cope with it emotionally and socially. So you wouldn't have a single mother bringing up a child on her own. She'd be out probably with a group of other women, also with young children, sharing childcare while they're doing the gathering or digging or whatever.
But the reason I brought that up is it's heresy to even raise this as a possible issue, even if we're trying to look for good solutions. Even if we say, look, have as many single mothers or single fathers or whatever else that you want, or 2 mothers or 2 dads, it doesn't matter. The fact is, without support, that's the whole issue. It's very difficult. But again, people are so political, and this identity politics and these agendas where they don't allow even that type of discussion. Because as soon as you say that, you're misogynist or some other terrible term. And that's what worries me. Because as scientists, as psychologists, as doctors, psychiatrists, whatever, our job is to look at the evidence in as disinterested, objective manner as possible. And that's not happening, especially when it comes to the trans issues. So I appreciate people such as yourselves. It doesn't matter if you're a professional or not. The fact is, by even speaking out against the trans narrative, you do put yourself at risk. And that's what I want to ask you as my final question. For each of you, in your personal and or professional lives, has there been any blowback for speaking out, for questioning, for trying to find out what's best for children and adults?
Yeah, huge. So it started with being trolled on Twitter and being called transphobic, really just for expressing the sorts of views I've expressed here. And then I got a call from the head of my national psychotherapy organization to say that he'd had some complaints from people who were questioning whether I was bringing the profession into disrepute. And I got a whole load of things posted online on local community boards, trying to warn people against coming to the clinic where I work in Brighton, and again accusing me of transphobia. And basically, that was before the book came out, so I don't know what's going to happen after my chapter in the book. But yeah, basically people have tried to get me struck off. I must say I've also had a lot of support as well. And a lot of people have said, yeah, look, it's really important what you're doing. Keep speaking out. Even if we don't entirely agree with everything you say, this needs to be discussed in an open way. And the chair of my professional organization, asked me what my views were and said, well, I don't think that's transphobic. You're just trying to open up a psychological discussion, and that's fine. Thank you for sharing that with me. So at the moment, I'm still practicing and my clinic's still running and I haven't been firebombed, and it's just a few trolls on Twitter. So I just hope it all pays off and that there's a proper and open discussion and this can be debated without everybody getting so aggressive with one another, and that we can look after the kids who are in our charge and the patients, if we're seeing adults who are also in our charge, and that we can do that properly with good information rather than feeling pressured by non-evidence-based lobby groups, which is how it is at the moment. So that's my final word on that.
Okay, thank you. And Miranda?
Oh, where do I even start? I mean, for some years I've been probably the only trans person that has publicly criticised or critiqued or taken issue with some of the things that are being taken as being read in trans culture, including trans kids and whatever. And I have to say that if the transgender activists, I use the word activist kind of ironically, because being an activist for somebody is doing something positive, and the activism is uniformly negative and abusive and threatening. The allies to these activists can be quite something else. And I think that that's a problem, because if you're engendering a culture where your allies are attacking people who are part of your culture, so I get trans allies attacking me and calling me a TERF and a transphobe and whatever, if part of what your culture does is to turn people outside of your culture against people who are in your culture, you've got a real problem, because those people, come the pushback, come the backlash, those people aren't going to give a fuck about you when you turn around and say, oh, but I'm trans. It's like, you disagree with them. That's it. You've had it. I think one of the worst things that we've seen in this country, there seems to be an aspiration among trans activists that there's some sort of freedom fighters who are going out on a limb all the time, when the reality is the opposite. The whole concept of gendered stereotypes or sex-based stereotypes is a prison that has been used to keep men and women and lesbians and gay men in check for centuries and whatever. It was absolutely no surprise to me after the appalling abuse that happened at the beginning of this year, January and February, when Julie Bindel was doing a talk at the Working Class Movement Library, the way that place was lobbied, the way that everyone was attacked. I was attacked, verbally attacked and abused online for a period of months beforehand. And it came as absolutely no surprise in September that we saw, in the name of transgender activism, we saw at least 2, maybe 3 males, 2 of whom appear to be trans-identified, who committed actual bodily harm on a 60-year-old woman. And it's absolutely no surprise that this has happened. It's amazing that what you've actually got is you've got at least 2 of those were natal males, one of whom you could see how far gone he was. In one of the videos, you can see him, he really up and comes out with a threatening body language against someone from his own group. That guy was there for trouble, and he doesn't really give a fuck about the cause that he's supposed to be there and ostensibly fighting for. And the problem with it was, okay, that happened. It's a bad situation. How do you make a bad situation worse? Well, here's what you do. You have transgender activists like Ruth Pearce going out and stopping trans people and trans organisations from condemning the violence. You have Stonewall releasing the most flaccid, most tepid condemnation of violence possible 3 days later that completely misses the problem of what was actually there and what had been going on, and including the no platforming of women and the intimidation that had been going on. And then we had this situation where this violence, they didn't just refuse to condemn it, they condoned it and incited further violence. And what we have to remember is that this is violence against women being propagated by men. And we've reached a point in our culture where, in the name of transgender activism, it has become acceptable in certain parts of the left, I would call the regressive left, for men with impunity to commit acts of violence upon women. And I think it is an utterly abhorrent situation to be in. And colour me not surprised that this has happened. You could see it coming. I don't know what to say. The whole incident left me absolutely speechless, and the lack of leadership that was shown by our LGBT organisations was just astonishing.
Right. Yeah, I wasn't over there, but I followed the news here. And just seeing how people were rationalizing, then it became like those memes, punch a turf, and
this is male violence against women.
Yeah.
And
transgender
culture, transgender culture glorifies male violence against women. That is a huge problem, and we are handing over our kids to these men to instrumentalize these children so that these men can have an easier ride of it, getting their surgery and their hormones. And the way that they're lobbying now, I think they're going to be looking at things like facial surgery and breast augmentation and all sorts of other things that they would demand with a national health system that is strapped as it is. It's all political, it's all horrible, and they should be ashamed of themselves.
Sorry. In your chapter, you did make reference to someone who was talking about the strategy about using children and veterans and first responders, right? Very, very political, very strategic. How do we get our needs met? How do we force people, or how do we coerce or manipulate people into bowing to our needs? So you do mention that in the chapter, and each of your chapters, along with the rest of the book, I think provide insights into this phenomenon that I hope more people will open their eyes, open their minds to, and recognize that some people maybe have the best intentions, but they're not going about it properly. Other people have some malicious or some nefarious intentions, and this is the way of actualizing it. And so I think we really need to be more critical and not just uncritically or blindly accept the narratives that are being promoted. And again, even if the narratives are done with the best of intentions, we have to look at the actual outcomes of them and whether there's any fact behind these. Just making ourselves feel good because we are showing, hey, we're not transphobic or we're not this and that. Look how liberal and progressive we are. I don't think that's doing anyone any good. So I really do appreciate having each of you come in and speaking with me.
Thank you very much for asking us and for giving the time for this and for helping getting the ideas out there. So, the gratitude is two ways.
Okay, well, thank you. I'd say it's my pleasure, but I feel it's my duty. I've got no skin in the game other than if we see something's wrong, if we have the ability to at least expose it, I think that's what we need to do. And so again, so thank you.